Hello and welcome to today's video. So in this one, I'm going to attempt to restore my old Orcs and Goblins army from when I was growing up and just get it back to a standard that I can put it onto a games table and not be, just disappointed in the results. So when I was younger, I was a big fan of Orcs and Goblins from Warhammer. So I've got all of these sort of like monopose orcs. Inside I've got one of the orc wyverns, I've got a whole bunch of night goblins, and I think I've got a lot of stuff that's still on sprue as well. Now, when I was younger, I was a fan of speed painting as well, but obviously all the tools didn't exist to make that easy. I had no technique, so some of these things are an absolute mismatch. I've got loads of things to do here. I'm going to try and keep it really simple as well, and the aim being just to show you that once you've got all like your block colours down, which pretty much is the majority of these, that just with a few shades and maybe a bit of a dry brush and some highlights on some of the big units, you can accomplish some pretty big step ups from what you're seeing right here. So let's see whether or not I can restore these. Now this is going to be part one of an ongoing series at the moment. So the first bit is going to be restoring all the old Warhammer stuff. And the next step is going to be 3D printing a whole load of different units and extra bits to go with my Orcs and Goblins army. If you want me to pick up some things on eBay as well and maybe see if I can just grab some of those to flesh out the army and do a similar thing to what I'm doing with these old ones that I painted disastrously when I was younger, let me know in the comments and we'll see what we can put together in the future. So the first thing that I'm going to have to do is just kind of gather them all up, fix any breakages. I think the vast majority of them are in a reasonable state. And then I need to go through and just think about the theme that I'm going to be using. Ideally, like I said at the start, I'm probably going to use some kind of wash all over them and just be pretty lazy with this approach and see how quickly I can do it, and then get on with the dry brushing to bring out some of those highlights, and then go back in and things like I've got this Grimgore Ironhide guy, absolutely loved him as a kid, just go back in and maybe fix him up a little bit. One of the big things I'm also going to need to do is something with these bases. So I've gone for the old Goblin Green technique that used to be back in the day. Pretty much everything that came out of Games Workshop, it always seemed to be that you'd base it in this Goblin Green. I stayed very faithful to that, and it just, it clashes so much. You've got all of this green on top of the orc, and then you've got all the green bases. So I'm going to have to do something with that, and whether or not I 3D print stuff or use some of my basing techniques I've used in the past, we're going to find out. So the first thing I needed to do was rebase them all. Like I said at the beginning, they were all on these Goblin Green bases, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you're playing, I guess, my old Hammer stuff, but I wanted them to just fit in a little bit more with some of the other stuff that I've been doing recently. So I went back in there, broke them all off the bases, which was relatively easy to do, and then I just got a whole bunch of these circle bases. I bought some of these infantry trays from eBay, and I really like them because they are square around the edges, but you can put the obviously round bases in, which is always a really nice little extra. I thought I'd keep it pretty simple, so I went with my usual base mix. Now, this is literally just a combination of recycled tea leaves, some polyfiller, some PVA glue, and then whatever color paint you want to use for this. So for this, I used brown and mixed in a little bit of black just to darken it up. Now, the reason I use this versus something like my recycled card basing method is because the recycled card basing takes like 24 to 48 hours to dry, and I was impatient. This mix takes around about an hour, 2 hours to dry, depending on how many tea leaves you put in there or how much PVA you put in, so you get a nice mix. Once it was all down on the bases, I got really lazy, and I figured I was just going to jam my miniatures in there. So I literally stuffed them in, hoping that the glue would hold. Now, after leaving them to dry for a little while, I came back in, and my idea was I'd go back in with a dry brush and do all of them. But the mix hadn't quite dried enough, so it was knocking them out of the bases. And at this stage, I was getting pretty lazy, and it was getting later on in the day as well. So I figured I would just go back in with my usual oil wash instead and just skip that dry brush stage. The reason I did this is because ultimately it would just let me leave them overnight so that oil wash would dry and the bases would completely dry as well. So for the oil wash stage, it's really simple. I really like it because it's quite effective. It's easy to do. Literally grab some oil paint and some spirits as well. Pop the spirit in first and then take as much of the paint until you get it to the consistency that you want. If you do it in the other way around, you'll often end up with too thick or too little. So spirit first and then start adding little bits of paint until you get it to that right consistency. Obviously, it's all down to a preference thing. I go relatively thick because I go back in and clean it up afterwards, but you can also go for pretty thin instead, and that way you don't have to do as much cleanup work. So again, it's up to you how you do it. I was toying between going for either brown or black, and the reason I chose black is because a lot of these, how I painted them originally, used to be on a black undercoat, and then I'd go back in and block in a lot of the colours over the top, leaving a lot of that black underneath it, which gave it almost like a cartoonish look instead, or a very high contrast that I think was in my mind at the time. So I wanted to just kind of match that throughout. So I went with black instead, but again, you could go for whatever colours you wanted. If you want to do all the green and get some really dark greens in there for the skin, see, that's completely up to you. I then left them for about an hour and then went back in with this little makeup Q-tips that I always use. And what I did at this stage is I just went for the areas that had the most oil wash left on like the high surfaces, so like the tops of the muscles for the orcs and stuff. Wiped it off, but left it all in the recesses. If you do this too soon, you run the risk of pulling all of that oil wash out of the recesses, and that just undoes all the work that you do. If you do it too late, it can be really hard to clean it up as well, and you have to go back in there with spirits soaked on those little Q-tips and wipe it off. So it's finding that happy medium. My method is I'll go back in and, like I said, do all of those high areas first, like tops and muscles, on the tops of the weapons and stuff where there wouldn't be any pooling, just areas where it's pooled. And then the next day I'll go back in there and I'll do that final cleanup where I use some spirits on the Q-tip and just do some of those higher areas. Once all the oil wash had completely dried and I was happy with the results I was getting, I went back in on things like the orcs, did a little bit of highlighting just to kind of make some of those colours pop a little bit more, but I was pretty happy with the results I was seeing already. What I wasn't happy with was with the wyvern. It still had kind of streaky wings, and even though I've not fixed it particularly well, it looks better than what it did beforehand. It also had awful washing from when I was a kid, so you could still see the really bright red and like all the ripples and the wrinkles of his wings. So I went back in there with some speed paint, it was the Crusader skin, and just washed it all over and used it like a darker wash. Fixed it a little bit, still not fantastic, but it's definitely better than what it was previously. And then at that stage, I went back in, rimmed all the bases just to make them look black all around, and then I called it done, because I was feeling relatively lazy and they were looking pretty good, or at least to an acceptable standard or a much better standard than what I had before. There are obviously extra things I could do. Things like the night goblins, for example, I could go back in on the hoods and do like the white triangles. I could probably lighten some of them up as well and give them some extra pops. But ultimately, I wanted something that's going to be quick, fast, and get on the table as soon as possible. And restoring these orcs and goblins was an absolute blast. It just kind of goes to show that just with a few extra steps, you can take your models from the ugly stage. And the vast majority of these models, as you'll be able to see in like the previous footage of these models before I'd done anything with them, were all at that ugly stage that we get to, where you've blocked in all of your colors and you just haven't done anything else. The really easy and simple step of just throwing a wash onto them and doing a little bit of cleanup afterwards worked miracles. They look so much better and I've barely done anything. So hopefully this is something you can take away. If you've got some old models that are kicking around that you kind of look at and go, I hate them, there's just something extra I need to do, and a simple couple of extra steps can really bring them to life and get them onto the table. If you've got models that you've been painting recently and you're just wondering how to push them a little bit further, then this isn't rocket science. This is something that loads of people do, but ultimately it really does work wonders. So I'm really happy with the results. Let me know in the comments what you think as well. Should I do more Orcs and Goblins? I think I'm gonna. I really enjoyed painting these, and it kind of restored some of my love that I had for these old models from back in the day, and now I just want an absolute massive green skin horde. Let's see what I can get my hands on next. So I hope you've enjoyed that video. If you have, hit the like and subscribe button, come along for some more content in the future. And yeah, let me know any projects that you're working on, anything that you're now thinking, actually you're gonna go back in, dig out, and restore back to its old glory that it should be at. In the meantime, stay safe, I'll see you soon. Bye.